welcome. Well, there is a cosmic traffic jam brewing in Capricorn. The traffic was already pretty thick, with Pluto having been in there for a few years and Saturn having recently joined Pluto. We will soon have Jupiter, the great heavyweight of the solar system, coming into Capricorn as well. That will occur on the 2nd of December of 2019. Currently, of course, in Scorpio, has to get through Sagittarius. But as we start to look at 2020, we are looking at this mega-stellium, this powerful concentration of planetary energy in the sign Capricorn. Saturn and Pluto will actually form their conjunction just one time, although they'll be dancing together through much of the next couple of years. January 12th of 2020, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurs. Saturn and Jupiter will chase each other through Capricorn. They'll be within the orbs of a conjunction without quite consummating it all through 2020. But at the very end of the year, December 21st, they both get across the line into Aquarius, and then Jupiter and Saturn form a conjunction. You can almost see the headlines in the astrology magazines, the journals, the workshop lectures and keynote addresses all across the world. Rightly so. This is a huge set of events, and all of it centered on the mysteries of the sign Capricorn. Now, I want to talk about this, obviously, but I want to talk about it in a kind of unusual way. I want to take a different perspective. I want to talk about how some young people, I'm getting old enough to call them kids, but some of them are already 34 years old, and so they're hardly that, are born to play a powerful role in this pivotal time, this time of choice and crossroads for the human race. What I am talking about is another concentration that happened in Capricorn. Neptune crossed into Capricorn back in January of 1984. A long time ago, it stayed there until 98. During that period, we had Saturn enter Capricorn. Here it is, come around again, a full cycle. We also had Uranus in there for a while. We have the epical conjunction of Neptune and Uranus in Capricorn, centered in 1993. By then, Saturn had pretty much moved on. We are looking at a period of time in which human beings were born with this Capricornian concentration in their birth charts. And they're growing up now. Something that was planted in them like a seed, as we will see, a seed of transformation, not just for themselves, but for the entirety of the human race. A seed that will shape the human future was planted in them, and that seed is now coming to flower. Hopefully, what I'm about to explore with you will be interesting to everyone. I would think it would be particularly relevant to anyone born between January of 1984 and November of 1998. They would at least have Neptune in Capricorn. We will deal with some dates and focus this a bit. But if you're one of them, or you love anybody born during that period, this talk that I'm giving here, I hope will be helpful. I hope it will cast some light on the personal, but also the transpersonal meaning of your incarnation, of why you are here. So, the very basic principle, whenever we have a concentration of energies in a given sign, as we're about to see in Capricorn. As I mentioned a moment ago, it'll be all the buzz in the astrological world, and people will be making predictions and talking about the meaning for human society connected with whatever event is happening. And that's well and good. That's solid astrology. We very clearly see the signatures of these meta-conjunctions or massive conjunctions on the shape of history, on the shape of the daily headlines. That is a completely valid and helpful form of astrology. But there is a way in which something even more important happens, but it's hidden. it's sort of on a long fuse. I can say it very simply. Babies are born. Babies are born. And these babies have within them the signature of these times. As they come to maturity, the seed, as I referred to it a few moments ago, connected with these natal structures, begins to manifest. I'll say something that might sound a little prejudicial relative to the kids, but in terms of shaping human history, we're born, but we're not really much good for anybody or anything for a while yet. For a while yet. We have to learn to speak the language of our nation. We have to get potty trained. It takes a while for the Homo sapiens kind of animal being in us to grow up and begin to make a contribution. I've often marveled, this will seem like a bit of a subject change, but not really. I've often marveled at how absolutely relevant to me today, at my age, are the love songs that were written by Joni Mitchell or Van Morrison. Back when I was a kid, and they're just a little bit older than me, not by much. And so to put it simply, these were rather screwed up people in their early 20s. If we look at their lives and biographies, they both left a trail of blood behind them. And Joni said, I used to count lovers like railroad ties, and she's a young woman, just being a young woman. And yet she wrote love songs that could speak to me. Part of you pours out of me in these lines from time to time. What a subtle, beautiful lyric. Or Van Morrison, she makes me righteous, she makes me whole, she makes me mellow down to my soul. It's just a beautiful little quatrain about how loving somebody and committing to somebody takes us out of that predatory mode that so often characterizes the sexuality of youth and makes us righteous and makes us whole. God bless you, Van Morrison, for those lines. And where I'm going with this is artists of every stripe often bloom when they're young. They can be in their late teens or their 20s. We always have examples of that. Taylor Swift, and the powerful work that she is doing presently in the world. Taylor Swift is a particularly interesting example in that we have Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune all in Capricorn, plus Mercury. The chart is a little bit dubious in terms of the time. There are conflicting times for her, so we're not totally sure of the chart, but we are absolutely confident that she has the big three in Capricorn, plus Mercury, which of course will link with her lyrical facilities. It's important to recognize that while we are looking at the passage of those three heavyweight planets through Capricorn, planting the seed for this extraordinary generation that is just now coming to flower. At the same time, some of them are Capricorns, of course, with the sun in Capricorn. Some have the moon in Capricorn. With Taylor Swift, of course, we see Mercury in Capricorn, and the rest of the faster moving planets, of course, made their passages through that sign. And so some of us are a bit more attuned, shall we say, to this particular vibration than others, within that population. Adele, we could sort of go on and on. There's a myth, maybe with a capital M, maybe not, that novelists often bloom a bit later in life, and certainly the long form novel, while there's ample evidence of people writing novels with absolute brilliance and insight when they are young, many of the great novelists can be understood to have done their greatest work in midlife or even beyond. Many of the finest painters seem to hit their stride, when they're rather gray-haired. Now, something absolutely fundamental to our understanding of Capricorn is that it refers to the government. The controlling logic of a society is Capricornian material, pretty much straight out of the textbook. And so we can recognize that a new world order in terms of government or more broadly social organization exists in seed form in this remarkable population of human beings whom we are considering here. At a practical level, though, while artists often bloom kind of early, as we have seen, typically for a person to come into a position of political power occurs a bit later in life for obvious practical reasons. This is hardly a law of the universe. It's just a pretty reliable pattern. And so I would guess that an awful lot of the future leaders of the world, the ones who will take us out of the present logjam, the conservatives versus liberals, et cetera, the ones that will actually lead us into a future that only they can imagine. Many of them are born. That's the whole point of this presentation. But I think typically they haven't yet quite stepped up to the plate. There is one very spectacular exception, though, in the form of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is an American politician. I'm aware some of you are in other countries and perhaps not so interested in the microcosmic picture of American politics. But this young woman, very much part of this generation, recently won an upset victory in a congressional district in the New York City area, overturning the long reign of her predecessor, who had been an established figure in the Democratic Party, seemingly not a bad person. It was often viewed as the biggest upset of the current season here in 2018 in terms of elections. Now, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we know her date of birth, but not her time of birth. So I'd like to show you her noon chart. And as you may have guessed, here she is, just a classic example with all three, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune in Capricorn. Now again, this chart shows her as having them in the first house, which I find plausible, but it is simply a random side effect of setting the chart up for noon. So what we have here in principle is that a planetary conjunction forms, and it leaves its mark on the headlines and the times and the society in which it is happening. And then it also leaves its mark in terms of this more diffuse seed. I refer to it as diffuse because the kids, the babies born under these conjunctions, their flowers will open over the next 20 years, or maybe nothing happens for 20 years. And then when they're 20, when they're 40, when they're 70, when they're 80, 100, some of them. In other words, stretching it a bit, but these things form. And then over the next century, we begin to understand the deepest meaning of these conjunctions. Now, where I'm going with this, and you probably sense which way the wind is blowing, is we see this mega conjunction in Capricorn, basically from the middle 80s to the end of the 90s, with a real concentration right in the middle. And those people, those babies born then, are now grown-ups. The eldest of them, about 34, the youngest of them looking at their 20th birthdays as I speak here. And so all of this, these seeds were planted then, but now we find this epical conjunction in Capricorn of Saturn and Pluto, and Jupiter just about to enter the sign as well. And obviously, this transiting triple conjunction presently in Capricorn is triggering the natal structures in these people who were kids but are now grown-ups, are now coming into the full power. They're coming online. It is their turn to change the world. And I want to explore that as deeply as I can. I'm in the funny position of, being an older man, talking about younger people, and they understand things that I do not understand. But I hopefully have a contribution or two to make here. At the risk of being a little tedious, I want to throw a bunch of dates at you, just so we understand the time frame we're talking about, just so we can identify the people who carry this seed of a new world. And I'll expand on why I use that rather hyperbolic reference soon. I think it's justified. So Neptune is kind of the overarching influence here. Neptune, of course, moves rather slowly, taking 165 years to get around the sun. So it entered Capricorn, touched the Capricorn cusp for the first time January 18th of 1984. Now, the entry of a planet into a new sign is often a little bit complicated, because what happens is the planet enters the sign, then makes a station, turns retrograde, goes back into the previous sign for a period of days or months, and then turns around and comes forward. Neptune's first contact with Capricorn, January of 84. June 22nd of 84, Neptune crossed back into Sagittarius and solidly into Capricorn November 21st of 1984. Neptune's exit from Capricorn and entry into Aquarius was similarly complicated. January 28th of 1998, it made contact with the Aquarian cusp. On August 22nd of 98, it returned into Capricorn for several weeks. It was November 27th of 98 before it was finally onward fully into Aquarius. It is tedious to say all these dates, but rather obviously what we are talking about is a period of 14 years or so, from 1984 to 1998. And that's like the umbrella over this earlier pulse of Capricornian energy. It is similarly complex with the planet Uranus. You can see here the dates. Basically, we are talking about a period from 1988 to the beginning of 1996. And by the way, Uranus and Neptune actually formed a conjunction 3 times in 1993. You can see the dates here. This is accurate, but a little bit misleading, with Neptune moving so slowly, and Uranus, no speed demon either, taking 84 years to get around the chart. These two remained within the orbs of a reasonable conjunction for quite a long time. How we define the orbs is somewhat arbitrary, but I would certainly look a couple of years on either side of the exact conjunctions in 1993. We have the further complicating element of Saturn's presence in Capricorn in roughly the same time frame. Saturn is, of course, the ruler of Capricorn, so it takes on a tremendous amount of power when it is in that sign. Saturn's first contact with Capricorn occurred in February of 1988, and its first contact, last contact with Capricorn, final entry into Aquarius, just about 3 years later in February of 1991. It's also interesting, going back to 1998, to realize that Uranus and Saturn were in a rather tight conjunction with each other, entering Capricorn only 1 day apart, with Saturn entering Capricorn on the 13th of February 1988, and then Uranus following the next day on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 1988. So essentially, and again, forgive me for the tediousness of throwing all these dates at you, we have this long period from 84 through 98, and then within that, the heart of the matter, the conjunction of Uranus and Neptune, and then kind of leading into the actual year of the conjunction of Uranus and Neptune, Saturn's passage through Capricorn. And so we have a rather brief period in which all 3 bodies were, in fact, in the sign Capricorn, a couple of pulses of that. And once again, you can see the dates here. Now, the children born under these energies carried inside of themselves the seed of something fundamentally new, a change in the basic myth of the world. This all revolves around the conjunction of Uranus and Neptune. I really don't want to ignore the role of the planet Saturn in all of this, and we're going to tie that in. But first things first, a good rule of thumb in astrology is the more slowly something moves, the more powerful it is, the more fundamental it is, the more seriously you have to take it. I've never seen that principle fail. And Saturn, while it's very serious, definitely moves a lot more quickly than Uranus and Neptune. The conjunction of these two planets occurs every 171 years. It's rather a clockwork kind of thing. And the power of it to shape history is absolutely enormous. I do want to say some words about that. Of course, I do want to frame it. I also, at the risk of sounding a little too mercantile for my own good, would recommend, if anybody is interested in pursuing this a bit more deeply, I wrote about it rather extensively in my book, The Night Speaks, which I actually wrote pretty much during the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the early 90s. And then later I went back and rewrote that section, or kind of reviewed it. I added something to it. I really didn't change anything that I had said. It's more like I made some commentary on what I had just said and gave myself a grade, so to speak, and also looked at it from the perspective of a couple of decades later, where naturally we're going to see things a little bit more clearly in the rearview mirror. At any rate, The Night Speaks contains a full-length historical analysis of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, but I want to talk about it at least briefly here. Now, Neptune is our dream of the world, our understanding of the world, how we have put reality together, the underlying beliefs. It's so funny to think of Neptune in pop astrology. It's usually represented as, kind of a spacey, dreamy planet, and that's fair enough. But reality is a dream. Reality is something that each culture invents. I mean, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? Ask somebody living in the San Francisco Bay Area in 2018 or 19 that question, and then ask a Navajo that question 150 years ago, or ask somebody from some traditional medieval culture what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. Reality is so much a construct. Reality as a dream, that's a way of saying it. It's kind of a Neptunian perspective. And Uranus, a planet of revolution, sudden change, expect the unexpected, individuation, breakthrough, throwing out the past to make way for the future. This is the nature of the planet Uranus. And so when this conjunction forms, we would expect a revolution in our myth of the world. Uranus meets Neptune, a revolution in our myth of the world, a revolution in our understanding of things. The term paradigm shift, of course, comes to mind, and it really works here. It really works, as we will see. I would think, for example, just to get a little perspective here, of the previous apparition of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, which occurred way back in the early 19th century, in the early 1820s. These two planets were close together. And as we look back at that time, it was a time of such revolutionary change. I'm an American, and so when I think of revolution, I often think of 1776, and a French person might think of the French Revolution, a decade or so later. But for much of the world, like especially the Latin world, 1820s, South America, country after country after country, rebelling against European colonial rule. The collapse of colonial rule is something we can relate to the last Uranus-Neptune conjunction, the time of Simone Bolivar and all of that. The American Revolution and the French Revolution, of course, have relevance here. They are tied to the discovery of Uranus, which is sort of another subject. But the collapse of the the myth of the colonial empire, the idea that a little nation like Belgium could rule a gigantic nation like Zaire in Africa, people believed that. That's the way it was. And it mythically ceased to be at the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. That was not the liberation of the Zaire, which used to be called the Belgian Congo, but the basic paradigm of the overthrow of the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires in South America and Central America, dating to this conjunction. It's one illustration, a change in the way we looked at the world. There's so much more. I think of an English gentleman by the name of Michael Faraday. And he's constructed in his laboratory downstairs a device where he can rotate a magnet, just hand crank a magnet inside a coil of copper wire. And as he does that, sparks come out of the end of the copper wire. Now, if we're English gentle people and we repair with our sherry and our cigars to Michael Faraday's laboratory, and he demonstrates this cute and fascinating trick to us, we laugh, we're interested, we shrug our shoulders. This man has just figured out how to generate electricity. Now, has electricity had any relevance to the world since the 1820s? Of course, it took a long time for it to fully catch on, but the beginning of the ability to generate electricity. Wow, the first photograph was created in the Uranus-Neptune time. The beginning of media culture and telegraphs were expanding suddenly, and the first steamship to cross the Atlantic, and the great explosion of railroads. We have fossil fuel-driven mass transportation. We have the generation of electricity. We have the ability to generate pictures, we have media culture, and these things strike me as even more important than the collapse of the colonial empires, although it all comes together and spells paradigm shift. Now, we hear paradigm shift, we hear that term quite a lot to the point that it becomes a little tedious and repetitive. But here's a term we don't hear often enough: the paradigm shifters. See, the paradigm doesn't shift itself. It shifts because of people who are thinking outside the box and changing things. And there is an awful lot of creative thinking that happens during any of these mega conjunctions or mega events, that's for sure. But we also recognize that while they're happening, babies are born. The very point of this whole talk, babies are born. And as those babies are born, this paradigm begins to flower inside of them, some of them figuring out what they could do with photography, what they could do with electricity. The events of the last Uranus-Neptune conjunction were significant. As we look back on them, they're clearly markers. But of course, it rested with the children to come forward and fully explore these possibilities. Let me say one more thing about the previous apparition of this conjunction, again centered in early 1820s. And that was one of the great holy books of the human race, was first published. I say holy books, and when I give you the title, you'll probably laugh a little bit, but I'm going to stick by it. Frankenstein. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And we don't think of that as a holy book. But if you think of Frankenstein, published in the 1820s, in Frankenstein, science creates a monster whose effects it cannot foresee or control. That's the essence of the Frankenstein premise. And doesn't it ring goosebump true when we think about the discovery of fossil fuel-driven mass transportation? It seemed like such a good idea at the time. What do we have now? Global climate disruption based on pumping all that carbon into the air. I don't want to make it like it was all a terrible mistake. It seems more complicated than that. Media culture. What has that been a good thing or a bad thing? I don't want to go back. I don't want to have no more movies. I don't want to have no more photography. no more television. Now, of course, these things were developed much later, but they're based on electricity and the ability to generate a photograph. So, science creates a monster whose effects it cannot foresee or control. The story of the period from the 1820s into the early 1990s, there is the last cycle of Uranus and Neptune. Now, another one was born there in the early 1990s, again centered on 1993. The children born then are, of course, now adults. But the cycle, as I mentioned, is 171 years long. We're only beginning to see its effects. I am confident, in history I think would be my witness here, that the explosion of the internet, of personal computing, of digital revolution in general, of email, which has completely changed the world. It's so hard to imagine a world like that, a world that was like the way it was before all of that happened. I'm just imagining that if it were in the 1970s, when I was a young adult, if somebody had told me that I would carry around in my pocket a little computer that could allow me to access all the knowledge of the human race, not to mention contact my close personal friends in China or Turkey or Mexico or Europe, I mean, I wouldn't have believed it. But of course, here we are in this new world. So much of it centered around the Uranus-Neptune conjunction, when the digital revolution gained mythic hold on the human race. The discovery of QB 1992 is not exactly a term on the tip of everybody's tongue. That was the first of the trans-Neptunian planets. This is a giant subject, and I've covered it elsewhere too. But the basic idea that we now have something like 800 of these bodies. We used to say out beyond Pluto, but now we've come to realize saying out beyond Neptune is a better way of saying it, because they have the nature of Pluto. They tend to be smaller worlds, ice worlds, full of astrological meaning. This is the discovery of the transpersonal realm. And, I'm thinking, of course, who would doubt the enormous impact of the digital revolution? And yet somehow I'm thinking that the transformation in humanity's imaging of its own consciousness and the mapping of the world beyond the ego that is happening now, I'm tempted to assert that the implications of that will be even vaster than what we are looking at with the digital revolution. I might point to the enormous pulse of breakthroughs in terms of mapping genomes and the replication of organisms, through genetic means and so on, that once again is a mythic revolution whose implications are so vast. And kids were born. Kids who are now in their middle 20s, and we can't call them kids anymore. And some of them are already blossoming and blooming as artists and describing a new world order, a new way of understanding everything about what it means to be human. They're creating that already. Some of the young scientists and engineers, what are they coming up with? I have a fantasy that will sound crazy, but remember, the cell phone sounded like a pretty crazy idea in the 1970s. I will make a prediction here. I have no idea if it's literally true, but it has the right feeling. It has the right vibration that there is a young scientific engineer currently in his or her 20s who is coming up with the basic principles behind warp drive, engage, as Jean-Luc Picard would say. Now, I have no idea if that's true, but the idea that we could perhaps travel to the stars, I mean, so many people would say impossible, but of course they said that about flight and and maybe the idea of little computers that we carry around in our pockets too. So I don't want to put any limits on this. I especially don't want to put limits on the children. Now, the point of all this and where we're going with it is they're being called now by the current apparition of planets in Capricorn. They're being called to manifest something of the basic vision that they were born to bring to us. This is their hour. Over these next couple of years, this is their hour. Now, I do want to make sure that we include Saturn in all of this. So once again, let me refresh you about the dates of Saturn's passage through Capricorn last time. Now, the quick way to say this is that Saturn was in Capricorn for about 3 years, from February 88 to February of 1991. This, of course, ignores the complicated ins and outs of crossing over the cusps, but that 3-year period, more or less. Now, this adds a very significant element to this matrix of energies. Now, this crop of Capricorn babies, and obviously they were not all sun sign Capricorn, but significantly Capricornish individuals who are coming online now. This crop of babies were a rather diverse group, of course, and each one carrying a seed, maybe a slightly different seed, that somehow comes to blossom in the form of a livable human future. And so as we reflect upon this, the particular contribution of Saturn, that is, we would realize that Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn. And so there's a kind of harmony between these two energies. And Saturn becomes very strong when it's in Capricorn. That's true of any planet being in its own sign. Now, strong doesn't mean good necessarily. That's a different concept entirely. Strong just means powerful. And Saturn, like the rest of the planetary energies, has a positive divine purpose and a dark side. There's not a single planet that can't be used negatively, and there's not a single one that doesn't have the potential of doing extraordinary and positive and healing things and giving us gifts. It's all there. It all depends on consciousness and how we interact with these planets. So Saturn and Capricorn together represent something I would call conservatism. Now, the word is a loaded one nowadays because of politics and, what we think of as the conservatives versus the liberals or the progressives and that whole giant mess. And when I use the word conservative here with Saturn in Capricorn, I really don't mean it as a reference to supply-side economics, homophobia, and traditional gender roles. It is not that. Not the denial of climate change. The idea that there are things worth conserving. It's a simple idea, the essence of conservatism. That people in the past were as intelligent as we are, and they knew things, and we might benefit from learning from them. The idea that we should respect our elders, that's a very Saturn and Capricorn statement, that we should respect our elders. And of course, it's a righteous thing to say. But I also want to emphasize that both Saturn and Capricorn are totally practical. That we should respect our elders sounds kind of idealistic. And yet when we go back into the first 99% of human history, we would recognize that those of us who had the instinct or the inclination to sit at the feet of people who had managed to survive for a long time, in other words, older folks, well, they had something to teach us. They had demonstrated through their longevity that they had mastered certain arts of survival. And if we're humble enough to learn from them and copy the good things they have learned and maybe even learn from some of their mistakes and not repeat them, that we tended to prosper, we tended to have more babies. You can get totally Darwinian and biological about it. The practical reality of respecting tradition, of respecting our elders. not everything in the past is worse than what we have now. Now, an old person who I would not call an elder, but I'd be more tempted to call an old fart, would glom onto what I just said and immediately launch into how nothing is as good as it used to be. The music today is no good, says the old fart. The politicians, we used to have statesmen, now we have politicians, and after a while it's like, Grandpa, please shut up. I mean, even if there's truth in it, the young people don't particularly want to hear it. And I get the feeling that an old fart, it's an indelicate term, obviously, but an older person who is putting out that kind of stuff is not very happy. And we don't want to follow in their footsteps because their footsteps did not lead to happiness. They lack the humor and the generosity of spirit of a true elder. Nonetheless, an elder is a repository of the hard-won, accumulated wisdom of the human race. And I see these young people born with Saturn in Capricorn and now coming into adulthood, passing their Saturn return, obviously, as Saturn re-enters Capricorn and forms a conjunction with its natal position. This is another giant subject that I've covered elsewhere, but the two Saturn returns, the three Saturn cycles, basically youth and midlife and the cycle of the elder. So some of these people born with Saturn in Capricorn are now entering full midlife, full adulthood, entering life's long middle, when they will begin to accomplish extraordinary things. And their task is to remember that while we create the future, there are things worth conserving from the past. I would immediately, just by reflex here, say, well, the taking care of the earth, thinking about the 7 generations from now, as the Native American people did, there's a conservative policy. What are we doing to the water supply of the earth? What are we doing to the atmosphere? What are we doing to the climate? It is strange to think of these as conservative values, but the earth is worth conserving. I'm not sure we'll be able to put any of these young people in a simple box like conservative or progressive. I think they're getting pretty sick of the current logjam. I think they have a whole new political paradigm in them, and I don't think people my age can even begin to understand it. Yet there they are, building the new world, and I think they will go beyond those boxes. But I think that there will be conservatives among them, probably in the worst sense of the word, but there will also be conservatives among them in the best sense of the word, who recognize that we have lost some precious things that can be remembered and can be recovered. And those of us, those on the planet, in this Saturn in Capricorn generation, from 1988 to 1991, as their flower opens, they will begin to offer us this gift. We will have a group of people, 2 little crops of them, with all 3 of these planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, or pardon me, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, all in Capricorn. And this will be an extraordinary group. They will carry something that is just the essence of tomorrow, and hopefully some of the best of yesterday. Now, each of these groups will be, as I've mentioned earlier, offering their gifts to us, finding their voices, expressing themselves in art and science and literature, political leadership, social change. These will be the leaders of the new world, and they will be bearing fruit. There are already some of them bearing fruit, and there will be some that will write their great novels 25 years from now. And yet I have the feeling that the year 2020, when we have this triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto all operating in Capricorn, that year is a call for these young people to come forth and offer their gifts. And I think their gifts will be received. And I comfortably and rather confidently predict these flowers will open, and humanity may take us a while to recognize the gift, but humanity will have a basis of enormous gratitude as these younger people create the foundation, the mythic foundation of a new world in the year 2020. Thank you.